That Mike?
Okay, welcome. I'd like to call the meeting to order. It is 9:07. Stephanie, would you please take attendance?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Adrian Cochran,
Can never unmute fast enough here.
thank you. Andrea Comer,
Present.
Ellen McKitterick,
Present.
John Scott has not joined us yet. Mike Saltis
Present.
and Holly Williams will not be joining us. So we do have a quorum.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. I would like to thank the members of the public for joining us this morning. First item on the agenda is to review and approve the January 26, 2024 meeting minutes. I'd like to ask the committee for a review of those minutes and a motion to approve.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, the motion carries. Thank you. Next item is to review and approve the minutes of the February 23rd, 2024 meeting. Again, I would ask for a review of those minutes and a motion to approve them.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions?
For you, Mr. Chair, abstention as I wasn't present for that meeting.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. The motion carries. Thank you. Okay, moving to the contribution rate discussion. Aaron, would you please lead us in a discussion of that topic?
Absolutely. I'm going to share my screen. At the meeting last month, we had a couple of requests for additional information. So this is the first result of, let me shrink that so y'all don't have to look at yourselves. So we were asked to just show the impact of a 1-year reduction in the contribution rate to 0.45, and then what would happen if we reduced it for 3 years and then put it back up to the 0.5, just kind of to show kind of that isolated impact. So a reduction of 0.5% for just 1 year would have approximately 59 million reduction in the trust fund. If we were to reduce it for 1 year and then put it right back up. If we were to reduce it for 3 years and then put it back up to 0.5, it would have an impact of approximately 179 million. So, you know, it obviously makes a difference, right? So, but I think one of the things that this committee is doing that I think is really well taken, I'm gonna let John in, and since he had asked for the specific information, I'll let him see this slide. John, we were just showing the sort of 1-year impact of an impact of a 1-year reduction in the rate, which is about 59 million. If we were to keep it for 3 years and then go right back up to 0.5, it would be about 179 million. So it's significant, but it's not necessarily insurmountable. The thing is it's also not particularly logical, sort of an arbitrary, just like, oh, hey, let's just throw the dart at the wall. And I think one of the things that the committee is rightfully looking at is a more systematic approach with kind of some factors and bases to kind of plan for. So we asked Spring to help us pull together just a report of what the other states are doing.
Sorry, there's somebody's providing some feedback. They mute everybody.
It might actually be, it might be my dog. So hopefully it'll stop.
Okay.
He doesn't like the neighbors. He doesn't like people walking by. He likes the neighbors. He just doesn't like people walking by. So we did ask, and we compiled information about what other states are doing, just because we do like to look and see what we can learn from. Only about half the states have a set formula in statute. So half of them, it's not stated at all. They just kind of either have a projected total or they have an actual formula. Of the ones that have some sort of information, we've highlighted the pertinent information on this slide and on the next one. Second, may essentially look at cost of administration plus benefits paid. And they may or may not have a maximum contribution rate. As we've talked about in the past, the states that have a maximum contribution rate, that rate is higher than ours. Then the closest is DC at 0.62, but everybody else is much higher. So, it's interesting. It's not necessarily information, and we'll share this slide with you in case you want to read it in more detail. I'm just going to go to the next page. There's not a lot of science behind some of these rates. They're just sort of a best estimate. But one of the concerns that we identified is that they tend to be retrospective as opposed to prospective. So when they're looking at what we think the claims should be, so we can kind of make sure we have enough money for claims for next year, they're like, well, let's look and see what we paid last year, which may work for a fully mature program, but it doesn't take into consideration sort of our expectation that as a new program, we still have a ways to go before we hit full maturity. The other thing that we know from published reports is sometimes these calculations don't give them enough money. For example, Washington State, which this is their second, if not third attempt at a calculation, and did have to get a significant amount of money from their legislature to meet their shortfall based on their previous calculation. Even with this new calculation, they essentially work off a float for several months of the year. They always end their fiscal, they have, not always, with this new calculation, they have been able to end the fiscal year in the black, but during the year, they run out of money. And so they sort of operate on an unofficial loan from the state to pay their administrative costs until the contributions fully come in. And that's just way too close to the bone, I think, for us, because we have no source of a float. No one's going to loan us any money. So I was going to turn it over to Dave to talk about some of the factors that we think are important in setting our own formula. But before I do that, I just want to stop sharing and see if anyone has any questions. And I can share again if anyone has a page they want to specifically look at.
No, but Aaron, you're going to send those to us?
Yes, we'll send these out.
All right, thank you.
I do have a quick question.
Sure.
And this is just in terms of determining how much money we should have available. I know when we went through the baby bonds program, we sort of based it on an estimate of how many babies would be born eligible for Husky. As part of our determination, did we estimate how many babies would be born? And I only asked that question because I know there was a press conference this week to talk about expanding paid leave, even for smaller employers. And some of the pushback was around the amount of money that we have held. And so just from in terms of your comment about being prospective instead of retrospective, just wondering if we had taken that into consideration.
Yes, and thank you so much for raising that, because it gives us a chance to correct a common misunderstanding about the proposed legislation this year. We have proposed legislation that's really more technical, but the press conference was about paid sick days, which is not the same as paid leave. And people keep confusing them. And so thank you, Andrea, for raising that so we can correct what the people are saying. Paid sick days legislation is to require all employers, not just employers of service employees, to provide a minimum of, I think it's 40 hours of sick leave accruals for their full-time employees and a prorated amount for their part-time employees. And those sick leave accruals could be used for sort of your common everyday illnesses that may not be a serious health condition, right? It could be, you got poison ivy and you just really need to stay home and keep slathering calamine lotion on yourself for a day. Or you have a really bad cold, but as we know, that's not a serious health condition. But, nobody wants their wait staff to be coughing and sneezing into the food. So you should stay home for a couple of days. That's what those paid sick days are for. And that would be paid for by the employer. That's really not the paid family and medical leave insurance fund that we use to pay benefits for people who have serious health conditions or are caring for their families. So what we have in our trust fund is really irrelevant to that. So thank you for that opportunity to do a PSA. Going back to your actual question, we do work with the actuaries to assess likelihood of claims, which does include likelihood of pregnancy and bonding claims going into the future. And we look at Connecticut's experience as well as FMLA experience nationwide and census data and all sorts of things. So they do have estimates of what those will be and the likelihood that people will come to us for claims. And that rolls up into sort of that estimated take-up rate. Right now, when you're talking about number of claims that we receive compared to sort of the overall working population in Connecticut, we have a take-up rate of about 0.4%. I'm sorry, 4%, which is right where we were estimated to be. We anticipate that to grow over the next few years, several years, until we get to full maturity. So we are taking that into consideration. But that is a great segue into what Dave is going to talk about, unless anyone else wants to talk about the calculation, the formulae that other states use.
I have a question, Erin.
Yes.
You keep talking about getting to full maturity. What is your estimate of a timeline to getting to full maturity?
We have been working with the actuaries, and this is consistent with the previous consultants we had as well. The estimate is probably around 5, 6, 7 years. Is that right, Dave?
Yeah, around the 5-year mark.
Yeah. So, we know it took California almost 10 years, but they were one of the first states and they didn't do, one, they're giant. Two, they didn't really do a whole lot of outreach. And it was sort of early. New Jersey took over a decade, but again, different circumstances, not a lot of outreach. So we're looking at kind of Washington, Massachusetts, but they're only a year or two ahead of us. So but we anticipate somewhat of a shorter time frame than California, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. So that's why we're thinking that 5, 6 years.
So what defines maturity in a system like this? I mean, how
That's
do
a
you
great question. When you don't see growth year over year, right? Like your growth, when you're not seeing like full percentage points of growth and take-up rate. So so when we can kind of settle in and think this is about where we think we're going to be.
Okay.
I
Yeah,
will
we
point
have-
out, and we've talked about this in the past, even when you think this is about where we're going to be, even the fully mature states that have been operating programs for a long time saw a lot of growth in the past few years. I think that was in our October slide deck, where I think we talked about like Rhode Island, California, New Jersey, where you think they'd be fully mature and not see a lot of volatility, they were still seeing a big growth post-pandemic. So not due to the pandemic necessarily, but in the years in 2021, 2022, even into 2023, they were seeing consistently higher rates than they'd been seeing pre-pandemic. So we can't ever truly say we know exactly when it's going to stop growing, but we can say we're no longer new and we're likely to grow at a much, much slower rate. I think that's what we're thinking about for maturity.
Okay. And I got one more question, Mike, sorry.
Go ahead, sorry.
The private markets have all renewed their stuff by now. So what did we see in the private marketplace as far as rates compared to what we're charging?
So no private plan can charge their employees more than what we charge.
Right,
So
but they can charge less. That's why I'm kind of looking at, what are they
Yeah.
charging?
So I know we looked at that. We looked at that in the fall. And I can pull, and it didn't change very much in terms of that first tranche of renewals. So I can pull that data for you and get it to you. Unless anyone remembers and can find it while I'm trying to cudgel my memory. My recollection is at least half, but probably more, we're at the 0.5%. There was a good number who were like, we'll do 0.49. We'll do 0.485, like
Right.
just close to the 0.5, but just enough to be like, we're doing little. There wasn't a lot of plans. And then there were plans that were like, we're not going to charge our employees anything. We're just going to pay. And we're like, okay. There weren't many of those, but there were some. So that there wasn't a lot of like movement. I will tell you that we have heard sort of unofficially, some concern that it's hard to go too low. You can't really go much below 0.5, but that's something that is actually something we were planning on talking about with all of you once we get through this section, which is one thing we could do is once we come up with what we think is a good approach, we could always put that out for public comment and public hearing and have the committee do a public hearing if we wanted to. We've never really done a public hearing, but we can. And that might be an opportunity. Or we just put it out for comment and have written comment. But that's something that we can consider that can help get more up-to-date information for the kinds of questions you're asking, John.
Okay.
Mike, did you have something?
I did. A couple of thoughts. Number one, and I hesitate to put words in Harindra's mouth, but we did ask him some meetings ago about when we know, we're I don't know if we use the word maturity, but that concept. And I believe he said it's when you can have a predictable trend within a range. You're not going to have a dramatic spike up or a dramatic spike down. So that's kind of what I've been focused on. But a couple other comments. One is, you mentioned all these other states, whatever formulas they have are based on retrospectively. But what else would actuaries base formula on other than retrospective? And if there's some growth in the birth rate anticipated or another pandemic, what else what are even the possibilities to base a formula on other than retrospective?
It's such a great question to transition to this next slide, but I will quickly answer. You could look at least in part on what you anticipate for the next year. Right? So if you anticipate
Right.
a growth shouldn't that be taken into consideration as opposed to only looking at the past? But I'm going to turn the mic over to Dave to explain this slide, and then we can talk more about the factors to consider.
Okay.
Okay, thank you for that lead in. So as Erin mentioned, we're looking for a way to formulaically determine what the rate should be, so it's a little more scientific and a little less of a judgment call. So one of the things we worked on with our actuaries at Spring was, what are the key elements that a formula for the rate calculation should consider? And we came up with 5 components to that effect. The first one, Erin already mentioned, was the rate cap that we have of 0.5%. It does limit the flexibility we have compared to other states. Because if another state lowers their rate and they determine, oh, that rate was too low this year, they can make it up by raising it next year. We don't have that flexibility because we can't go past the cap. So we have to consider that. Number 2 is we should be considering not only the current balance, but the future balance as well. And how far into the future? We should be looking at a long-term impact. And traditionally with Spring, we've been looking at a 10-year horizon. That's been consistent with the recent analysis, but it really gives us a broader view of what's going to happen with the fund. Because if you only look at it for, like, say, a year, you have the potential to mask any long-term trends. And that could unintentionally affect the fund in a negative way that nobody wants to. So it accounts for anticipated changes that you're having in the future. You know, for example, incident levels going up, i.e. the take-up rate, what's going to happen there. So it's more of a look forward than a look backward. And so then once you look at the fund balance, see what's going to happen in the 10 years, and then you say, okay, well, what do we think the fund balance is going to be 10 years from now? Then you compare that to number 4, which gets to what Andrea was asking before, which is, how much should we have? What is that contingency reserve that we should have? And that contingency should conceptually be made up of the risk of lower contributions or higher benefit payments and expenses, or both. It needs to account for the unanticipated changes, shock events we've seen, such as recessions, pandemics, things of that nature. And if you remember from the last time, we showed a slide with various what-if scenarios of what could go wrong. For example, one of them was, what happens if contributions decrease by 10% over a 3-year period, while at the same time, benefit payments and the related operating expenses increase by 25% for the 3 years? What's going to be the effect of that, and how much would we need to weather that storm? And that's just one example. How much do we set for that? Well, that's our appetite for risk and how conservative we want to be. I don't think I'm speaking out of school when I say the authority does tend to be conservative, and their risk and our risk tolerance is fairly low. We're not looking to go out on a limb for anything. We want the fund to succeed. We want the fund to continue paying at full benefits, and we don't want to be in a position where the fund is running out of money, to put it bluntly. The last component we considered was minimizing the volatility of rates. And what I'm saying there is, how much do we want the rate to change? Because if we go through the calculation and the rate, instead of 0.5 is 0.499, do we really want to change the rate for that little bit? Or do we want to establish certain thresholds, like like a tenth. So 0.5 to 4.9 to 0.48 to 0.47, so on and so forth? Or do we want it to be a quarter of that, from 0.5 to 0.475, 0.45, et cetera, et cetera? Because we don't want to be making little changes all the time, because we've gotten feedback from other states and employers that the less the rates change, the more they like that. We don't want to be that state that's changing the rate a little bit here and there, and there's really no meaningful change to that. So that's something we're considering. So these are the factors that we're considering for the formula. If you're on board conceptually that these are the formulas, that these are the components of the formula, then we'll continue working with Spring and applying them to an actual formula. And we could present some drafts of possible formulas at our meeting next month. Anyone have any questions or commentary on the components we're considering?
I'm thinking.
Well, I have
Okay,
a few.
you're
I
right,
mean,
John.
I agree with you. I agree with your last point that we shouldn't be going 0.1. You know, it's going to come down to nickels, right? So whether it's a quarter point, my gut today tells me that's, you know, rounding however we round up or down to the nearest quarter point. That's kind of my gut reaction on that. On your comment about conservative, especially given where we are in the stage of development, I agree 100%, is that whatever formula we come up with should be on the conservative side. Could always tighten down the road if we become comfortable with it, but I wouldn't be a hero coming out of the box and cutting it, going on the aggressive side. Okay, whatever those terms mean. I do have a question, just in round numbers. How much do we take in a year revenue and how much do we pay out in claims?
Well, we're going to go over the budget in a few minutes, Mike, but I could tell you that, like, in really round numbers, the money we bring in is revenue is roughly $450 million. And the benefits paid out are roughly $363 million.
Around 100 million a year.
Okay.
And then there's obviously operational expenses. We have about, $45 million.
Okay. So I just one of those numbers. So roughly we're taking in 450 and we're paying out 400 for the
Right.
cost of the entire operation. So we have a built-in cushion of 50 million a year. That's just kind of round numbers. Okay. Anyone else have comments?
Yeah, I guess my question, I don't know if this should be part of this, if this is still even a discussion point, but what about reinsurance or some sort of product like that to help us with this stuff? Could that make our lives a little less expensive?
I'll jump in on that. So when we talked about reinsurance in September, I think I had shared that based on our initial analysis, there's really not an existing product for this. But generally speaking, most insurance companies would want 3 to 5 years of claim history. If we were to look for reinsurance, it would require really bringing in a specialty broker to kind of help us shop it around. And so we didn't pursue it beyond that, because that would be an unbudgeted expense. So that is something that we could continue to explore if the board wants us to spend the money on that. The concern we had with the reinsurance was, we earn interest on the trust fund. And so, if we're essentially self-insuring against risk. By keeping that money in the trust fund, we're earning money off of it. If we were to purchase reinsurance and reduce the trust fund, we'd be both paying out for the reinsurance and we'd be losing out on the opportunity to earn interest on those funds. And so, there's definitely a question as to whether that is the most appropriate way of addressing these risks. But, again, we can consider working through that, but it's not like just sort of saying, here's an RFP, somebody reinsure us. It would require a commitment of time and money to help us work with a specialty broker who could even craft it so that it could be shopped around for bids. And so we really kind of put that back on the board to tell us as a board if you want us to do that.
I guess I'd like to know what that would cost. Then we can make a decision on that if that's something we want to add to the budget. And I guess just thinking out loud, is there an insurance product that we could buy into, that would kind of do this for us, and then they using the benefit of an insurance company, like Aflac's paying our claims. Do they have an insurance product just like this or similar to this that would meet our needs?
The short answer is no. Like it's not a product that's currently on the market. The question would be, would there be anybody willing to kind of create some sort of specialty for us? Generally speaking, when they say that it's going to be couture instead of off the rack, that means it's going to be expensive. But we don't even the fact that we would have to work with a specialist, even create something that we could kind of shop around. This is just, it's not done. Nobody's done it. And we were told, don't do it yet. You don't have enough because no one's going to look at you without 3 to 5 years of claims history. But we can certainly, it's not like it's never a possible idea. It's just, it's not a panacea.
Right.
What I would like to ask the committee to consider is letting us know if there's any additional. I mean, we can certainly come back next month with what Dave was talking about, which is sort of actual numbers and showing some scenarios with actual numbers. If you all kind of on board with the factors, do you think there are any factors that we didn't list that you think should be listed? And we'll send this all around to you so you have it. So you have a little bit of time too to think, hey, wait, what about X, Y, or Z? Thinking about kind of the roles of our different committees and their responsibilities. One question we are also grappling with is if we were to adopt a formula that the board uses every year to assess the contribution rate, would that formula be something that we would need to adopt as a policy, therefore going through the full kind of regulatory process? Right now, the statute gives the board unfettered discretion. And so, we don't have to have a policy, but again, and none of us really want to just throw darts at the wall. So do we need it to be a fully formally adopted policy? Do we want it to be a fully formally adopted policy? Technically speaking, that's a great question for the Policy and Personnel Committee to consider. So for those of you who are on PMP, you should be looking for that in our April meeting. If any of you are not on the Policy and Personnel Committee but would like to join in that discussion, you can join that committee meeting. But I think that's the right committee to tackle that specific question. Is this something that requires the full notice in the Connecticut Law Journal and all of that? And then even if it doesn't, as I mentioned before, do we want to consider soliciting some public comments, some public perspectives? This is obviously something that affects all of the employers. It also affects all of the insurers. We like to get people's perspectives. So do we have to? Do we want to? And those are things that I'm going to ask policy and personnel to really think seriously about under their jurisdiction. I also know we have a obligation to have this committee look at the budget, and that is in our plan of operations. So we have to get to that today. So if people are willing, we could move on to that topic of the agenda, if everyone's good with that.
Can I just make one more comment?
Of course.
I assume, but I shouldn't assume, that in whatever, let's just call it a formula we come up with, we're gonna add language that gives us the opportunity to modify it for under appropriate circumstances, right? That it's not gonna be locked in 100%, no matter what happens, we can't change, right?
Yes,
Okay.
because that is exactly the lawyer in me having that exact same feeling of, I don't just want numbers, I want words.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So shall we move on to the review of the draft budget? The next item on the agenda. Dave, would you please provide us your review?
Will do. Well, now that Erin has warmed us up to her opinion on numbers, we'll go over the budget. So thank you, Erin.
Numbers
Appreciate,
are great. I love numbers.
appreciate that lead in, Erin. Thank you very much. So here we go. Okay.
Hmm.
Bear with me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, everyone can see it, correct?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. Okay, so it is that time of year again where we prepare the annual budget for the authority. Some of you have been through this before, so it may be deja vu. Some of you may not. Just a refresher, because it is something we do once a year. Okay, so as most of you probably know from my financial review every month, we look at the budget in 3 buckets: operating, bond, and contribution. The operating budget is the budget for the operations of the authority so that we could administer the program. The bond budget is the budget we have that allows us money for system builds of an IT nature and improvements. And the contribution budget is the big one. That's the one where we budget the contributions coming in and the benefits going out, as well as other operating expenses, because that's where the revenue for the operating budget, the first item, comes from. So we'll start with the operating budget. The operating budget revenue for the coming fiscal year, which is fiscal year ended June 30, 2025, is $20,361,000. That's mostly made up of the administrative fee that comes from the contribution budget for the operations. That's been consistent with prior year budgets. The remaining balance are fund recovery penalties, which we just started assessing in July of 2024. On the expense side, we've budgeted $18.4 million. And so that leaves about $1.9 million in the operating reserves. And so the significant expenses that we've had, probably not a surprise to many people here today, it's salaries and the related expenses, the contact center, which handles support for employers with questions they have regarding the program, outside IT support, outreach and engagement, grievance adjudication, which is the work that DOL does for us for appeals, and software licenses. So what was some of the thought behind some of these numbers? So the administrative fee revenue, as we pointed out, was $20 million. We look at what the expenses are going to be and then determine the revenue number appropriately. And again, that number has been flat since we've started doing the budget. The fund recovery portion of the operating budget is made up of penalties. And that's based on the historical trends that we've been seeing based on the contributions that's been coming in, again, since we started this in July of the current fiscal year. On the expense side, one of our significant expenses is payroll. And a key assumption in there are the salary adjustments that happen every year. And so we budgeted 2.5% for a cost of living adjustment and a 3% for an annual increase. And those amounts are based, number one, on the current contract that the state of Connecticut has with CBAC, and also on the state of Connecticut's tentative agreement that they have with CBAC for the forthcoming fiscal year, because the current agreement ends in fiscal year 2025. These increases are consistent with prior year increases, so there's no change there. The second key component assumption is the fringe benefit rate. That's at 84%, 24% for health benefit and other benefits, and 60% for the pension obligation. That's based on the current rate we're expecting. We did reach out to the state and ask them if there's going to be any changes in the pension obligation rate, as they do change it every year. And they indicated that while it's not set in stone yet, they don't expect it to increase. It might decrease, but again, it's not set in stone, so we're leaving the rate at where it is for now.
Well,
Outreaching-
just to be clear, if we're paying somebody $100,000, it's costing us almost 200.
If we're paying somebody $100, yes, it's costing them it's costing us $184. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Outreach will include our new community education coordinator initiative that we discussed at the last board meeting. That's a big major push for us. So we'll have additional monies in there. And then IT support is also a significant expense. And that includes things like platform work, security, continued improvements for fund recovery, website maintenance, as well as money set aside for actual continued development and enhancements of the fund recovery system. I know there's a lot of numbers on this page. It's Erin's favorite of the whole presentation. But I did want to just go over with you how our current budget, which is on the left-hand side, or rather I should say the budget for the upcoming fiscal year 2025 on the left-hand side, compares to our prior year budget of fiscal 2024. And then all the way on the right-hand side, how it compares to our updated projection for the year. So in terms of revenue, our budget is $339,000 higher than last year's budget. And the main driver of that is fund recovery penalties. At the time we were budgeting last year, we had very conservative estimates for what the fund recovery penalties would be. Now that we've got some history, we've bumped that number up. Projection-wise, you'll see it's $4.5 million. That's only because we didn't transfer the 1 quarter of the $5 million during the current fiscal year because we had enough money in the operating reserves. So that's why that increase is there. In terms of expenses, as I mentioned before, the upcoming fiscal year, The upcoming fiscal year, we budgeted $18.4 million. That compares to the prior year budget of 17.3. That's an increase of over $1.1 million or 6.7%. What are the drivers of that increase? Well, as I mentioned, payroll, pension, and benefits. The pay increases are number one. We've also got some staff additions in there. We budgeted 48 full-time positions by the end of the year in fiscal year 2025. Last year in 2024, it was 46, and we had a lead up to that of other positions. And you'll see there's a more substantive increase. That's because we currently have about 40 people now. So some of the open positions still haven't been filled, but the budget assumes they will be filled. Outreach and engagement, I mentioned a new initiative. We have set aside $405,000 for that. The annual effect of that initiative is $750,000. You may remember that number, but we're not starting the initiative exactly on July 1. It's probably not going to kick off full time until around October. So that's why you don't see the full 750 there. IT consultant services, we anticipate some rate increases for the services people are currently providing. There's also some fund recovery development money in there, money set aside for security enhancements and things of that nature. So just work we need to keep the systems current, because we obviously don't want to fall behind with anything, because then it just gets harder once you're behind the 8 ball if you're not staying up to date with everything. That includes the cost of software licenses. We expect the cost of some of those to go up as well. One of the reasons for the over $200,000 increase is we expect to pay more for our fund recovery license. Because our fund recovery efforts have been so successful, it's pushed us into a higher tier for that license. So we're going to be paying more for that. We're also anticipating getting a better Salesforce community cloud upgrade. So we've set aside some money for that. The next line is consulting services. That is specifically money we've set aside for a board directive, indicating work we should do for succession planning and looking at our organizational structure. We anticipate needing some outside help with that. So that's why we've set aside some consulting money for that. We have our usual $250,000 contingency in the budget, which historically we haven't had to use much of, but we still do have it there just in case. There are some offsets compared to last year's budget. Grievance adjudication, i.e. the work, the appeals work that's done by our partners at DOL, that's $860,000 lower than the prior fiscal year budget, because now that we have another year of activity under our belts, we're just seeing that the appeals coming in is lower than we certainly budgeted for last year. So we've updated that number appropriately. Also, printing and postage, we've budgeted a lower number because last year at this time, we were just going to start the fund recovery efforts. It was going to be our first year doing it. So we budgeted very conservatively in terms of how much mailings and items we would have to do. Now that we've done it and we've gotten a lot of work getting employers on board with being compliant and getting better information from employers who are no longer eligible for the program because they're closed or they don't have Connecticut employees or anything like that. We've been able to fine tune how much we're going to pay for printing and postage. So that's why that number goes down year over year over budget. And so those are the key components of the budget expenses and why they changed year over year. That I know that was a lot, but I just wanted to give everybody some perspective compared to what we have now. Moving on to the bond budget, just as a reminder, the authority has $50 million authorized for it. Out of that, we've allocated $16 million to date. We still have $2.4 million remaining of the bond budget. And for the upcoming fiscal year, we only expect to use $1.2 million. So we're not budgeting any additional allocations for bond money in the upcoming fiscal year. We're going to use the existing funds and some operating funds when necessary that were in the IT budget that I just discussed a few moments ago for continued system enhancements. And again, continued enhancements to the employee contribution platform, the website, security, fund recovery, all those things. Moving on to the contribution budget. For the upcoming year, we have budgeted contributions of over $464 million. Comparatively speaking, we have some fund recovery money in there. There's two components of fund recovery. Number one, the actual contributions we get from our fund recovery efforts, and a smaller piece of that, the interest that employers pay in who weren't compliant. We've also budgeted some investment income at $23.7 million. And so that's the revenue piece. Expenses, we've budgeted $379.2 million for benefit payments going out for the year. Our admin expense that we pay to Aflac is budgeted at $25 million. The admin fee paid to the authority is $20 million. You should be getting deja vu because that is the same number on the operating budget. And then our annual bond repayment of $2.1 million. That leaves a budgeted amount in the fund balance of $636 million by the end of the fiscal year. So where do we come up with some of those numbers? So the key components are, in terms of contributions, the contributions coming in, assume a 4% salary growth year over year, which is somewhat reduced by an expected change in unemployment. And there is an increase in unemployment expected built into the budget for the year. So that somewhat tempers the growth of the contributions. Fund recovery, like I mentioned before, it's based on historic collections. And also, we just started placing older fund recovery efforts with an outside agency, a third-party debt collection vendor, and we are conservatively estimating that we will recover 5% of the amounts placed with that agency. That percentage does come with conversations we've had with vendors in the past on how much they expect to collect on debt of this nature. Investment income, we have conservatively budgeted a 4% rate of the balance. We are currently earning 5.4%, but we are seeing that we don't expect the rate to go up anymore. And in fact, the rate may in fact go down. We did talk to the state of Connecticut on how they're estimating their investment rates, and they said the same thing, that they're expecting the rates to go down. So that's why we're budgeting at a lower rate than we have now, because we think that's likely. So we don't want to budget too aggressively and back ourselves into a corner with the investment income. As far as expenses, on the benefits side, it's based on the latest projection that we worked on with Spring, which was the fiscal year 24 quarterly second quarter experience report. And it does include an incident rate of 4%. As Erin mentioned before, we're at 4% right now. We just hit that. So we are carrying that forward into the next fiscal year for the whole year. So that's where those assumptions come from for benefits payments. The benefit administrative fee is based on historic costs, budgeted at $25 million. That's consistent since we started doing work with Aflac. And that number also allows for a price increase because the contract does allow, as of January 2025, for a price increase. So the number we do have built into the budget allows for that to happen if there is one. The paid leave administrative fee, again, same as the operating budget. And the bond fund repayment is based on the terms of repayment for fiscal year 25. It'll be our third payment, and that's based on 3.5% semi-annual interest rate over a 10-year period. Again, I just wanted to show a comparison of year over year of the changes in the numbers, both from a budget perspective and also a year-end projection, updated numbers. The contribution revenue, we budget at 464 million. That's higher than last year's budget. Again, it's based, why is it going up? The actuarial estimates changed. The primary driver of that is salary growth. And that's the reason, same reason from last year's budget, or even from our current year projection of $450.7 million. Mike, that's where I got the number we talked about 15 minutes ago. All right. So that's where it comes from. So we are expecting some salary growth. The investment income is higher than last year's budget. Why? Because there's a higher principal amount that the investment income is earning off of. So that's why it's about $1.5 million higher. It is lower on an annual basis than what we're projecting for the current year by $1.3 million. Why? Because we're currently earning 5.4% in the current fiscal year. But again, we're expecting that to drop to 4% in the next fiscal year. So that's why it's lower. Moving on to the expense side, we are budgeting benefits of $379.2 million. That is lower than what we budgeted last year because we do have better, if we have a whole year more's worth of history. Last year, we were just starting out, so we budgeted very conservatively, and we're still budgeting conservatively, but now that we have a better year of data, we can get it a little closer to where we think it'll be, so that's why it went down. But it is going up compared to where we think we'll end this year. This year, we think we'll be at almost $363 million. And so we think we'll be about over $16 million higher in the upcoming fiscal year, or over 4.5%. We are seeing the average weekly amount of benefit payments go up. Weekly amounts are roughly at about, we've seen, it's not unusual to see $7.5 million paid out in benefits on a weekly basis. And we've seen that, I think, at least 3 weeks now in the past month or two. And last but not least is the administrative fee. Again, it's $5 million higher than we're projecting last year, but that's because we didn't transfer the $5 million because we had enough in operating reserves. So in total, the expenses year over year budget are $20 million lower, but the main driver of that is because of the benefits. And they're about $23 million higher than where we're projecting this year. And again, the same reason, the main driver of that is the benefits. We're expecting it to go up year over year. All right. So what does that all mean for the Finance and Audit Committee? So we have sent you the budget documents in more detail. And so the plan of operations allows for the Finance and Audit Committee at least 31 days of a review and comment period. And that would be at the next scheduled Finance and Audit Committee meeting at the end of April. At that point, we would finalize the budget with you all on that day after answering any questions or reviewing any comments you have. And then the next step would be reviewing it with the board and asking them to vote for approve at the next board meeting in early May. If the board thought more time was needed, that they needed more time to look at the budget and vote for its approval, they could do so, because the plan of operations requires that the board approve the budget by the end of May. So if the board wanted to, they could call for a special meeting if they wanted more time to approve it by May, or they could vote to wait until the next meeting, which would be early June. It's the right to do so. Historically, that hasn't happened, but that would be the latest that would happen. I know that was a lot, but budget's obviously pretty important. We want to make sure we lock the numbers down and have enough resources to do what we need to do, but certainly within reason. So at this point, I'll ask if anybody has any questions regarding the budget.
Dave, if we have questions as we review them, should we send them to you or should we wait until April 26th?
You either or. You can, if you can certainly send them to me as you have them.
Any other questions, comments? Okay. Seeing none, shall we move to the next agenda item, a budget review of spending to date? Dave, would you please provide us that update?
Will do.
We can see your screen, Dave.
Thank you for the confirmation, Stephanie. Okay, so we are going over the financial results as of the month of February. So for the month of February, our operating expenses were $898,000, and we were ahead of budget by $601,000. Year to date, we are better than budget by $2.9 million. The spending for the month were typical expenses, no big surprises. Payroll and benefits were $633,000. The contact center was $128,000, and our outreach efforts were almost $85,000. In terms of the bond budget, we didn't actually have any bond spending this month, so we were ahead of budget in what we anticipated. So year to date, we're also ahead of spending. And as I had mentioned previously, we did have bond proceeds budgeted, but we didn't get any. So but we still have money outstanding from the bond schedule. As I pointed out before, we have about $2.4 million available to us. So we'll be using that as we need it. Moving on to the contribution budget. The contribution activity for the month of February was relatively light, was at $364 million. That did create a negative variance of almost $2 million. However, that was somewhat offset by our contribution activity of almost $479,000, as well as the positive variance we had in investment income of $512,000. On the expense side, our benefits paid were over $28.7 million. That equates to about $7.2 million a week on average. We are seeing that creep up again after a seasonal lull we saw in December and January. So all in, our activity to date of negative $27 million compared to what we budgeted of negative 32.3 is almost a $5 million positive variance. And again, that's mostly due to the benefits paid being paid out less than what we budgeted. Year to date, we have a $31.6 million variance, almost all positive variances across the board. There is almost a $2 million negative variance in contribution revenue. However, that's almost completely offset by our fund recovery efforts. So we have gotten contributions there. So they almost zero each other out. So it's really just a question of where the contributions are coming from regular contributions or our fund recovery efforts. But in all, we're in solid shape going forward for the rest of the year. The contribution balance as of the end of February was $569.4 million. So no issues there. And total assets for the authority were almost $590 million. Again, most of the money in the short-term investment fund, in short-term investment fund. Again, it's earning currently at about 5.4%. Projection for the end of the year, we expect the expenses to come in at around $14.2 million. That is a positive variance of about $3.1 million. The main drivers of that continue to be payroll and the related benefits. The positions are being filled later than they were budgeted for. Also seeing a positive variance in lost my train of thought. In grievance adjudication, the appeals work. Again, as I mentioned during the budget, the volume is coming in lower than we expected. So that's creating a positive variance driver for us and the main driver for the expenses. I know you see a negative variance here of $1.1 million for income less expenses. But again, that's just because the administrative fee coming in was $5 million less than what we budgeted. But that's because, again, we had enough money in the operating reserves, so we didn't have to transfer it over from the contribution budget. And that positive variance is right here. And the contribution budget also has a positive variance we expect by the end of the year of $61.7 million. We do expect across the board to have positive variances, not only for benefits paid, but indeed also for contribution revenue. The first quarter payments will be coming in next month. So we do expect a bump up from that as well. So those are our financial results for the month of February. Does anybody have any questions regarding those?
Seeing and
Okay.
hearing none. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Okay, let's move on to next item agenda, old business. Is there any old business anyone would like to discuss? Seeing and hearing none, we move on to new business. Is there any new business anyone would like to discuss? Seeing and hearing none, we move to adjournment. May I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Thank you. The motion carries. It is 10:15 and the meeting is adjourned. Thank you for your time this morning.
Have a good weekend, everyone.
Bye,
Yeah.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks again, everybody.
Bye, thank you.